Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all the angles, covering the past, the present and the future. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
Here we go again. Last time we reviewed Clarkesworld, the magazine, and we compared it to a magazine from, 70 years earlier? Mm-hmm. And we had some good response. The main response we got was from Mr. Clarkesworld himself, Neil Clarke.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's great, isn't it? He sent me I think it was a Facebook message saying, just listen to your podcast. Thanks for reading the issue. He then says, it was nice that you picked up on the international nature of the magazine. It's something we value highly and have taken efforts to build. On the question of how Clarkesworld is funded, which, Colin, I think you and I were a little bit mystified by how they can possibly afford to do this, to give away their content in the way that they do. Neil says, the income is primarily paid subscriptions via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Weightless, etc. I don't know Weightless, but that's one of the things he lists. Also Patreon and direct subscriptions and support from readers. On the question of advertising, he says advertising and the anthologies that they publish also play into the equation, but to a much smaller degree. And here's the interesting bit. Less than 10% of readers support them financially. And he says that's a problem. And that is what I suspected. Because they're giving away the material for free, most people are going to read it for free. But obviously they would like some income. So if you do read it for free, send them a bit of money, will you? He then says short fiction is often underpriced. They're not losing money, but he does admit that their staff is underpaid. But then he says we're in better shape than most online SF magazines. Many of those don't pay their staff at all. That's really very interesting to hear that.
That talks about a real dedication to the field and to the individual project they're working on.
Absolutely. One other thing that I mentioned last time was the order of the stories in Clarkesworld, because I said it's a first world problem, but the stories were showing up in a different order on my Kindle to what they were elsewhere. And he said that it should be the same on all devices and in the podcast feed as well. And I have to say, it probably was just one device of mine that was displaying it differently. But he does say that the Kindle subscription files are generated by Amazon and that Clarkesworld have no control over the navigation there. There is a way to skip to the next story or back to the previous story, but it varies based on the device you are using. So that was probably my very minor issue, that my Kindle was displaying things slightly differently. But
I'm tempted to say something negative about Amazon and the Kindle just because I haven't liked them and I've never been a fan of them in general, but they are the predominant reader in the ecosystem for ebooks. So
yeah, and I've had a succession of Kindles over the years. Both e-ink and tablet type. I've probably had about 5 over the years. And I do quite like them, but they are the e-ink ones are a bit awkward to navigate, especially when they got rid of physical buttons. On the earlier ones you had physical buttons, and it was possible that, each button could have a function, and so you could have complex navigation, but now it's all done through touchscreen, and they had to minimise the navigation in order to cope with that.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I buy an ebook, I always try to make it a downloadable independent format. And then I can either sideload it into my Nook, or you can go through the hoops of emailing it to whatever the special address is for your Kindle account, and
that's it.
Amazon will manage it for you then. We
did have a couple of other comments on the last episode. One from Jim on Facebook in the Best Science Fiction and Fantasy Short Fiction group. It's a group that I mentioned in the last episode, and he suggested that the group should read The Cold Calculations by Amy Ogden, which we talked about last time. And Emmanuel commented on Twitter saying, I appreciated the discussion about authoring, the creative process, and the realities of publishing. People often don't know about these aspects of getting a story out there, and it's important to remind them. And I completely agree with that. I really think you get a lot more out of a story if you know the context. So if you know how the story was written, why it was written, where it was published, and all that sort of thing. I think all of that context really adds to the richness of a text rather than just seeing a story in isolation. Mm-hmm. And the last comment comes from our friend Seth on Twitter, who just left a 4-word comment. That quiz was brutal. So there we go.
Yeah, he actually asked me for the link to the entire quiz, not just the parts that you did.
Yeah, that's true. I only did part of it, didn't I? And
well, and it was very long. I think you survived 15 questions.
I did look at the whole thing afterwards, actually, to see if I would have done better or worse if we'd carried on. And I think I would have been about the same overall. Now, not in the last episode of this podcast, but in a recent episode of another podcast, Colin and I were reviewing Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama. And as part of that discussion, I threw in a comment from the science fiction author Mike Resnick, who referred to another book. He referred to James White's novel All Judgement Fled, published in 1968. And Resnick said that book was Rama done right. Now, I found that an intriguing comment. I hadn't read James White's book before, and Colin, you hadn't read it either, I don't think, at that point?
No.
And we were both intrigued, so we went and read All Judgement Fled, so we'd like to talk about it now. So this is a book that was published before Rendezvous with Rama by a respected British-Irish science fiction writer who Arthur C. Clarke would have known. I mean, whether he knew him personally or not, I don't know. He certainly would have known him by reputation. So James White publishes this novel, 1968, All Judgement Fled, and it's about a giant spaceship that just turns up in our solar system, and we have to go and investigate to find out what the heck is going on. A few years later, Arthur C. Clarke publishes a novel, Rendezvous with Rama, with the same basic premise. So the question is, did the later book copy from the earlier book? Is one of them better than the other? So what do we think? How long did it take you to read All Judgement Fled?
So I read it twice.
Yeah.
I read it in January, soon after we talked, and I got a copy of it from Amazon. And it took a surprisingly long time to read. On the second read-through, I think it took me a total of 5 hours.
Right, yeah.
But my first reading kept on being interrupted and broken up, and I felt like the plot was dragging, and I wanted something to happen, and that I read it the second time in fewer chunks, and so it was a much more enjoyable read.
That's really very interesting. I didn't read it twice, but I read it about 1.5 times because I started reading it and I got distracted by something else. There was something else I had to read, and I put the book aside. And when I came back to it, I found I couldn't quite remember enough detail about what was going on. So rather than try and carry on from where I left off, which was about the midway point, I simply went back to the beginning and read it from the start. So I've read it about 1.5 times. And I admit, in the first read, I had a similar kind of response to what you've just described. I think what happened for me is I was expecting a story that was primarily about the spaceship. But what it turned into in the early, I suppose about the first third of the book, it became about the individual astronauts, the characters. And I think in that first read-through, I found that a bit frustrating because what I really wanted was a book that was the same as Rendezvous with Rama. I wanted it to get on with the Rama stuff. But when I went back to reread it, I actually got really absorbed in those characters. And it made me realise that what James White was able to do was give us a set of distinctive characters who were absorbing and interesting, which is something that Clarke absolutely does not do in Rendezvous with Rama. You know, Rama is famous for not really having much characterisation in it. But it's interesting that we both sort of found All Judgement Fled a little bit of a drag at the first attempt.
Yeah, there are a number of similarities between the two books. There's the idea that this alien ship comes into Earth and then we send a ship out to visit it. And in addition to the action happening out on the ship with our explorers, there is the societal and the cultural changes and discussions because of what they are doing and how people are responding to it.
Yes, so we hear about what's going on back on Earth, don't we? And there is this communication which gets increasingly strained as they... because the spaceship is quite a long way away from Earth, and is it something like a 30-minute delay when they communicate?
Yeah, 15 minutes each way.
Yeah, that's it. So it becomes almost impossible for there to be dialogue between Earth and the astronauts, and it ends up being kind of both ends of the conversation turns into a rant. They rant at each other. Thematically, I thought that was quite interesting because the book doesn't really dwell on the idea of communicating with the aliens. That surprised me a little bit, I have to say. I kind of assumed that it would be a first contact novel where it would be an attempt to talk to these aliens who we cannot understand and they cannot understand us. But it doesn't really dwell on the communication, largely because as soon as they go inside the spaceship, they're all more or less attacked by these sort of starfish-like aliens and some other species as well. So they don't... It's almost as if they don't have time to think about communicating because they've got to defend themselves and at the same time try not to harm these aliens who may be perfectly benign. Otherwise, they're just defending their territory. But of course, one of the differences with Rama is Rama doesn't appear to have any life. There don't appear to be any aliens. So did you find that an interesting difference?
I did. And, compared to the amount of time it takes to encounter, I wouldn't say anything of interest, but the bots, the droids that tend to show up, the aliens in All Judgement Fled, they show up almost from the get-go.
Yeah.
I want to say it's their second entry into the ship.
I think so, yeah.
The first time they go in, they open and close the door a whole bunch of times because they want to try and get someone's attention, say like, hey, we're here. we want to come into your house whether you want us or not. And then the second time that happens, well, then they find a bunch of aliens and get attacked.
One of the aliens I think it has a kind of a horn that projects out of its body or something, and it sort of uses that to stab the astronauts, and they kind of get taken out one by one. First of all, one of them has a tear in the spacesuit, and then first of all you think, oh no, they're going to die, but they don't die because the alien spaceship is pressurized, so whatever is in their spacesuit will stay in their spacesuit, kind of thing. But if they go out of the alien ship, the pressurization's gone, and the tear in the spacesuit would simply suck all the atmosphere out of the suit, and the astronaut would die. So there's some really tense moments where individual astronauts are under threat, and some of them do get bumped off. And I can't remember how many survive. Is it half of them at the end? 3,
yes.
Yeah.
We should probably also mention the difference in technology on the human side between All Judgement Fled and Rendezvous with Rama. Yeah. Rendezvous with Rama has what I would call a more modern technology. Mm-hmm. They seem to have access to lots of tools and fuel and oxygen and food. Yeah. The people in All Judgement Fled, this is very, very reminiscent of the early space flights, where there are 3 astronauts in I want to say it's 8x4 space. Yeah. It takes many, many months to get there. Yeah. They're packed in with the minimum amount of food and water and equipment to do their entire mission, to go out and come back. And they don't have any spare spacesuits because space is just so incredibly tight. So if you lose your spacesuit because you've been attacked by one of these aliens, you're stuck on the alien ship.
Do you know what? I actually really liked that aspect of it. I mean, we need to bear in mind the book was written in 1968. Well, it was published in 1968, probably written a year or two earlier than that. And And that was before the first moon landing. It feels like they're in an Apollo spaceship. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, made it feel very real. Yes, a little bit dated from where we are now, but not hugely different. You know, even the spaceships that go to the ISS now are really quite cramped little things, especially the Russian ones. It reminded me of those space films from the 1960s and early 70s. So there was a film called Countdown, another one called Marooned. Can't remember the others, but there was various space films made in the 60s that were sort of inspired by Apollo-level technology. And that's what I got from All Judgment Fled, and I really liked that aspect of it.
Yeah.
What other differences did you pick up on?
I think Rendezvous with Rama and All Judgment Fled share the question, why did the ship come here?
Yes.
That is really never answered in either case.
Yeah.
All Judgment Fled left me with another question, which is, why in the world would you have a spaceship filled with carnivores? Are they supposed to be a food source, or were they for experimentation? Or surely they could have picked something a little less dangerous.
Yeah, you'd think you would take sheep rather than wolves.
Exactly. Yeah. The cover of the book that I got has a beautiful picture of the alien spaceship on it. Mm-hmm. But I kept wanting to have a picture of the twos. So our astronauts see 3 different kinds of aliens right from the get-go. There are 1s and 2s and 3s. And the 1s you only see once.
Yeah.
And they're never mentioned again. The 2s are these very violent, aggressive hunting carnivores that come in packs. They're well adapted to zero gravity, and they can handle going through a ship with all of its points for moving yourself and moving cargo very easily. Mm-hmm. Much easier than we can as people. Yeah. And then the Type 3s are these kind of flying white fuzzy carpets that are like flat cats almost.
Yeah.
But they constrict. So between the 4 tentacle arms with the claws on the end and the big central spike and the carapace it talks about, I really want to see a picture of that someplace.
Yeah, I felt that as well. I tell you where you can see a picture. If you go to the original magazine publication of the book, which was published in 3 parts in If, the science fiction magazine, or Worlds of If, it was serialised, and each part has a couple of illustrations. And there is some imagery of sort of mission control, so it does look very much like Apollo. There are some images of the astronauts kind of floating around in zero-G, but there are a couple of images where they're being attacked by a 2. And it's like a gelatinous starfish.
Wow.
I didn't see a carapace as such, but I did see the sort of the multiple legs and the starfish formation. So some nice line drawings in there. What I'll do, I'll grab some of those and I'll put them on our website so people can have a look at those. Or I'll put them on Facebook as well. It is curious that by the end of the book, our astronaut hero, who's called McCulloch, who's really a doctor and sort of functions as a psychologist as well during the book. Mm-hmm. By the end of the book, he kind of thinks that he has figured it all out, and it is explained what they think this spaceship is, that they think there is kind of one alien who is the intelligent one, but it's probably almost cornered in its quarters by all these mad carnivorous aliens on the loose. But what struck me is that everything he comes up with is pure conjecture, and that is the same as Rendezvous with Rama. We're presented with a series of clues, and all the astronauts can do is infer what might have been intended by all of this. And I found that quite fascinating, because it's first contact, but it's more or less saying that we're not going to be able to communicate with anything that comes from another world. We can try, and we can try and understand them, but we're not going to be able to talk any more than we can communicate with whales or dolphins.
Yeah, I found it kind of interesting that of all the people they sent, they did not send a linguist. Of course, in this case, I don't know if it would have helped. The intelligent alien life form is so different from us. Yeah, so they try to make a bunch of inferences based on photographs and magazines and books that they find on the alien ship, and trying to, retroactively explain the current situation on the ship. So, like we were talking about, why would you bring this large tribe of, carnivorous animals on there? And they explained that they've probably been breeding for a while and made more. And they did find a desiccated corpse that they suspected was another type of an intelligent alien, maybe, but they just didn't know.
You just mentioned magazines and photos, and I found that a little bit weird. I find it hard to believe that aliens that are physically totally different from us would have the same technology, that they would have evolved to make books the same way that we make books. Even on our own planet, books vary from culture to culture. For thousands of years, books were scrolls. And it was only at a certain point in the history of Western Europe that people started binding books and making them into things where you turn pages. And yet these aliens have evolved that same technology as well. I just found that a bit weird, especially since they don't appear to have fingers.
Yes.
What do you think overall? Do you think Rama appears to be influenced by the James White book, or do we think that it's just coincidence?
When I talk about adapting books into movies, we often talk about, did you take the core of the idea, or did you fully adapt it down to plot lines and characters and everything else, or did you do something in the middle? And I would have to say this is the very core of an idea. Now, granted, there's only 6 years of time from one to the other. They're both British authors. Clarke was quite a bit more popular than White, at least on the international side.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking about how little I know about non-American science fiction.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And so, especially in light of the Clarkesworld magazine that we just read, and this book by James White, who was apparently a very popular British science fiction author, I'm feeling the desire to be a little more widely read than I currently am. That's not a bad thing.
That's good. I don't know James White enormously well. I think I might have read one of his books prior to this, but I've kind of always known about him because he's among a relatively small handful of British authors who were sort of always there in science fiction in the, probably in the 60s. I wasn't really around in the 60s. I was born in the 60s, but I had no idea of science fiction at that time. But during the 70s and the 80s, he was always there. So Arthur C. Clarke, Bob Shaw, Ian Watson, Christopher Priest, J.G. Ballard, Brian Aldiss, James White. They were always there. They probably all knew each other because it's a very small world, the science fiction world. All of those authors I've just named, very different, not at all stylistically similar necessarily, but all part of the British world of science fiction. But I hadn't read really very much James White at all prior to this, and I was impressed by this book. I'd kind of stayed away from James White because I assumed that it was very basic, kind of nuts and bolts science fiction, and not of any great thematic interest. But I found this quite thematically fascinating.
Yeah, in certain aspects, it was very prophetic. Especially with current events. I wish I had the forethought to write down the page that this quote is that I'm thinking of, but it talks about how NASA had made the decision that all of the information coming back from the two probes, Prometheus 1 and Prometheus 2, would be completely open to the public. So everyone is listening to everything they say and seeing everything they send back.
Yeah.
And what happens is, as the astronauts begin to defend themselves and then later to attack the aliens that are attacking them on Earth, there's a huge uproar happening where, because of the loss of some spacesuits, and the amount of time they're spending on the alien ship, they're going to not have enough water to get back, and they don't have any way to get all the people back onto the Prometheus ships, the probe ships. So they're going to be a resupply. And Brady, who is the general on Earth, is trying to explain to them, we do need to know what's going on, but everyone can hear everything you say. And so between the militant side and the ASPCA side, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals,
or aliens.
or aliens, you cannot win. Everything you do will be wrong, and so please just report facts and don't talk about, attacking the aliens. But it was this idea about how polarized people got. Because the news picked it up and they would amplify one part versus the other, which inflamed the populace. We're kind of sitting in that world right now.
The interesting thing about this kind of open microphone policy, that really does echo the Apollo era, because that's how things were. The Apollo astronauts did actually have a back channel where they could talk privately, but for the most part, everything they did and said was broadcast. Again, James White is reflecting the reality of space travel at that time, but you're absolutely right. It is prophetic of where we are now and in terms of how people react. But I thought the psychology of the book was really quite fascinating. The insights we get into the individual astronauts. There's one who's really on the verge of a nervous breakdown at one point. And there's some really interesting comments made about what it takes to be an astronaut. And White actually says something to the effect that to be an astronaut, you have to be an introvert. Now that kind of leapt out at me, because I thought, I'm really surprised at that, because many of the astronauts that I've read about or read their books or seen them interviewed and so on, they seem the opposite of an introvert. There are some that appear introverted, but most of them appear not to be. But then I started thinking about, no, there is a clear difference here between alpha male, which is to do with behaviour and outward behaviour, and then there is the scale that runs from introversion to extroversion, and they are not necessarily the same thing. And so I think I learned something about what it takes to be an astronaut from James White. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know, but it convinced me in the moment, and that's the main thing, I think, for a work of fiction.
Yeah, suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, exactly that. It sounds like we're giving this a thumbs up, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Would we go so far as to echo what Mike Resnick wrote, which is that this book is Rama done right?
I personally didn't find that many things wrong with Rama. I obviously missed the lack of characterization. This does such the opposite, that you spend so much time in people's heads with their thoughts and fears and traumas and stresses.
Yeah.
I definitely like the book. I don't think it is heads and tails above Rama. Given that it was published first, it's probably more creative.
Mm-hmm. There's supposed to be a Rama film in production. What would be interesting is if somebody cottoned on that there is this other novel out there, bought the rights to it, and made the film, and they both came out at the same time. We've seen that in the past with, I think, was it Armageddon and something else? I can't remember now. But you often get Hollywood, two films that appear to be very, very similar coming out at the same time, usually based on a different source material.
Yes. Yeah, and that would be the other thing, is that this book, you cannot find it in ebook format. You probably read the copies off of the Internet Archive.
Yes, that's where I found it. I don't know if it is technically out of print, but it's not as easy to get as many other books. James White, another thing I meant to say is that he wasn't just successful in the UK. He was one of those handful of British writers who made a very successful career selling stories to the American magazines. So he was published in, Worlds of If is where this novel first appeared, but he was also in other magazines. I can't remember exactly which ones, but I'm sure he was in Analog and others that were around in the 60s and 70s. So, and he was published, I think, I should have looked this up to check, but I think his books were published by Tor, as well as British publishers. So, he was quite well supported through his publishing career.
Yeah, this copy I have is from Ballantine.
Ah, right, okay, yeah.
And in the back, there's that order form. I was very tempted because the books are only 75 cents each.
Bargain.
Yeah. So, hey, if anybody listening to us happens to know James White's estate and who has control of his books, push for ebook publications, because I think you'll find that people will buy them and read them.
Yeah, I think so. Just a couple of things to finish on the subject of James White. I went looking for some interesting quotes because I wanted to find out what his approach to writing was. And I found on one web page a quote where he said something like, here it is, of course, the plot idea must come first, but the characters soon take over. And then he says some authors, Bob Shaw for example, always know where the story is going at any given stage, but I prefer to give my characters more leeway, allowing the story to evolve from their individual natures. And then he says, you might say that Bob Shaw uses a map to show where he is going, while I use a compass. That rang true. That's what All Judgment Fled feels like. It feels like he set out with the idea of exploring this alien craft, and then the characters have started doing what they do, and then he's gone into the exploration of that. And I think that's really nice. I like stories that breathe in that way.
It felt like a very natural thing to have happen. There's a lot of argument between NASA and General Brady on Earth and McCullough after Colonel Morrison dies, because he then becomes the default leader, about who is in charge of this mission. And there is such a discussion about, the people with the boots on the ground really know what's going on, versus Brady trying to say, I need to be able to supply you and have intelligence to guide you and tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me, this was written during Vietnam.
Yes.
And that, I think, was a very, and I'm projecting, I think it was a very common issue that came up, where because of the nature of the war that was fought, there weren't lines. You went out in small parties and tried to accomplish missions and either attack or defend, and often had to do things on spur of the moment with good judgment or not. And you see that happening time and time again through this book. So I wonder how much of an influence the current events were on the construction of his characters and the decisions that they make.
Very interesting. Yeah. I don't know. More research is needed. Speaking of research, we had a little mystery, didn't we? You saw that he had won a prize for this book.
Yeah, so on the Wikipedia page, and I do a lot of my research through Wikipedia first, it mentioned it won the 1979 Europa Prize. That's an 11-year gap. I wonder how that happened, and so I tried to find the Europa Prize, and I could find no mention of it on the web. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it just means that I couldn't find it. And so I turned to a friend of mine who is well-versed in British science fiction and has his own podcast and does it with me right now.
Oh,
I said, yeah, hey, Phil, have you heard about this prize or know how to track it down? And you said something along the lines of, no, but I'll ask the British science fiction Facebook page people.
Yeah, I had not heard of it. I also did a bit of Googling, and it turns out it's a really common name for a prize. I found an architecture prize called the Europa Prize. There was something to do with interior design. It seems a very common name, unfortunately. But yeah, I used to be, years ago, involved in the British Science Fiction Association. Not really involved with it nowadays, but I am a member of the group, the Facebook group for the BSFA. So I thought I'll just post on there, because I know a lot of the, apologies for saying this, but I know a lot of the old-timers hang out in that Facebook group. And David Langford, who is, he's a multiple award-winning writer and fan writer, and is one of the people behind the Science Fiction Encyclopedia. And I posted the question, does anyone know anything about what this is? And he posted some information that he had that he suspected of what it was, and that gave me a thought of where I should go looking. So I went, there's a website called fanac.org, FANAC.org, which basically publishes old fanzines, preserving the fan culture. So I did a search, and eventually I found a fanzine from 1970 or thereabouts. And anyway, it was announcing Europa prizes would be awarded at Eurocon 1 in Trieste in 1972. And it was going to be a set of awards that would cover a period that ran, I think it was from 1966 to 1971. So it's a very wide time window, but it gives the impression that it was considered to be one of the best British science fiction novels between 66 and 71. And that's quite amazing, because there were some much more famous books published during that time window. So it just does suggest that, James White was really up there with the greats during that time period.
I had thought about asking the people on File 770, because they have a lot of fan history and knowledge in there.
Yeah.
And I think I still want to do that, but I want to do it in a slightly different context, because one of the many hobbies that I have is I'm an occasional Wikipedia editor. And when I see something wrong, I want to fix it. And when I see something that is generally important, I would like to add it. And it would be great to take the accumulated knowledge of what we can find on Fanac and File 770 and anyone else interested, and build the Europa page on Wikipedia and document all these works that were considered to be award-winning by the fans, just like the Hugos have been and currently are.
Now there's a project for you. That'll keep you going for a good decade, I reckon.
Probably.
Speaking of great authors, an interesting piece of news sort of dominating all the science fiction and fantasy websites over the last couple of weeks has been Brandon Sanderson's Kickstarter.
I backed it almost immediately when I heard about it, because I'm a big Brandon Sanderson fan. When I looked last night, it was $27 million.
Whoa.
And it has broken so many, maybe all Kickstarter records. It is the most funded. It was fastest to reach original funding. It was fastest to reach certain pricing thresholds. I think they're just about to surpass the largest number of backers, because there's a difference in how much money you earn versus how many people back it.
Yeah.
And the feedback from the science fiction and publishing community has been interesting to read and is quite varied.
I would say it's polarized, wouldn't you? That there are some people who say, great, well done him, and others who are, almost jealous, that why should one author have all this money? Can't it be spread around a bit?
Yeah. There's a quote from an article on Slate magazine. It's just another straight white Mormon guy making a ton of money. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. And especially today, when we're talking about being more diverse culture and reading and not being discriminatory and not being afraid of trying new books and new authors, you kind of wonder, well, why are we giving this guy $27 million? I think the answer is in a couple of things. One is he has a huge fan base, and he's very, very popular. And he used to spend 4 months out of every year touring. So he spent a lot of time with his fans, doing book signings and talks and conferences and all kinds of things. And that's how this whole Kickstarter came about. During the pandemic, there was no travel. And so he had 1/3 of a year that he didn't normally have, that he needed to fill with some way. And the way Brandon deals with stress is he writes.
Right, yeah.
So he wrote 4 full-length novels and a shorter novella that's probably going to be a graphic novel. The other thing he has done is he's had a number of successful Kickstarters, and he has built this large fulfillment company behind his authorship that handles swag and books and ebooks. And then, he launched a conference last year.
Mm-hmm.
So he has the ability and the need to keep them employed. And one way to do it is through an extremely large Kickstarter, which is essentially a subscription service for 2023.
I had no idea of that sort of background to it. I simply knew it was an author who'd started a Kickstarter. I hadn't known anything about the prior history.
The more positive feedback have come from younger folks, people on YouTube and other social media who've been saying, we have said this is the way that all publishing is going to be in the future, and it's about time somebody got around to proving us right, like Brandon Sanderson. And then John Scalzi, who I also follow as an author, had a bunch of thoughts about the Kickstarter and whether he should do something like this. And he basically said that, Brandon Sanderson is a different person than he is, and he has different strengths and weaknesses. And John is very happy with his current writing schedule, and that doing such a thing might work for him, might not. But he didn't feel a need to be jealous or anything other than happy for Brandon's success.
Oh, that's good. That's very gracious. David Gerald on Facebook said, while on the one hand I can admire and even applaud an author raising millions of dollars on a Kickstarter, and nothing I say is meant as criticism of either the person or his work, I have to admit some misgivings about branding. I fear that it turns the author and his work from a voice into a product. And then he goes on to talk about the authors that were his role models when he was a beginning author. So he refers to Heinlein, Ellison, Joanna Russ, Ursula Le Guin, Norman Spinrad, Arthur C. Clarke, Theodore Sturgeon, Spider Robinson, and quite a few others, he says. And he says what distinguished those authors to him was that they were writing from the heart and soul, and they were writing with passion, and because of that, much of what they wrote seemed timeless. So he's not criticising, but he's concerned that an author might be motivated by something other than passion for the work if there is a huge sum of money involved.
Yeah, there's a bigger discussion about authors and how they support themselves.
Yeah.
So, there are some authors that are passionate about what they write and are just trying to find an outlet for their works.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other authors. John Scalzi was offered a 12-book, very large 6 or 7 figure contract to write. Mm-hmm. And so he just writes and doesn't have to renegotiate each and every one of his books.
Right. Yeah.
Some people would call that greed. Other people would call that wisdom because he doesn't have to negotiate for every one of his books.
Absolutely.
In Brandon's case, he wrote all these under no contract on his own. Did he intend to sell them in the very beginning? I don't know. He certainly, is getting paid for what he did. Mm-hmm. Probably knew that because of his popularity, he could get paid.
Robert J. Sawyer pointed out that it was probably the biggest advance, and he puts advance in quotes, probably the biggest advance deal in the history of science fiction and fantasy publishing. And he said that on the 2nd of... Well, I've got it as 2nd of February, but it must have been 2nd of March that he said that. And I think it has doubled or possibly even quadrupled since Robert J. Sawyer said that. But yeah, it's a fascinating time period, and I wish Brandon Sanderson every luck with his millions.
Oh, I'm sure he'll spend a good, healthy amount of it doing the fulfillment.
I'm sure.
As of Tuesday, his fulfillment team said that to push out just the books, not the swag boxes, and then the electronic media, you send people a link and they download it.
Sure, yeah.
His fulfillment team said they need to send out 5.5 books per minute.
Wow.
As of Tuesday's numbers. And those numbers go up every day.
Have we got time for a quiz?
I have time for a quiz.
Always time for a quiz. So here we go with our amazing sci-fi character quiz. So what I've got here is 6 questions, and I've written these myself. I'm quite happy with these. I spent a couple of evenings pondering these things, and every now and again I came up with an idea. I thought, I'll write that one down. So I've got 6 questions here. In most of these, I'm going to give you a clue to a character in an adapted piece of science fiction, and your job is to name the work, either the book or the film, or both. If they're different, you can give me 2 titles. If they've both got the same title, just one title will do. So here's the first clue for this first character. In the book, he is called Ben Richards. Now, at any time, if you want to leap in and guess the name of the book or the film, you're welcome to do that. And if you don't leap in, I'll move on to the next clue.
No, I've got it. I Am Legend.
Uh-uh.
No?
No.
Oh, okay.
But save that. That might come in handy later.
Okay.
Let me give you the next clue for this one. So in the book, he's called Ben Richards. In the movie, he was played by an Austrian actor. And the third clue is, I'm sure you've covered this on a recent podcast of yours.
Austrian actor Ben Richards. Oh my goodness, an Austrian actor. The Running Man.
Yes. Yes, the title character of The Running Man is Ben Richards. And in the movie, I can't remember in the movie whether he's still called Ben Richards. I think he is. But anyway, he's played by Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
I thought that would be an easy one. Okay, here's the second one then. And again, a series of clues. Jump in at any point where you know the answer. So, again, a science fiction character. In the book, he was called Ulysse Meroux. A French name, Ulysse Meroux.
Planet of the Apes?
Yes, you got it. My second clue was going to be, in the first draft of the film script, he was called Thomas, and in the finished film, he was Taylor, and played by Charlton Heston, of course. Or technically, La Planète des Singes, being a French book. Item number 3. What's the difference between the character Logan 3 and the character Logan 5?
2? Just kidding.
That's one difference.
The correct answer is, oh my goodness, it's over a decade in age.
Very close. I'll give you that. It's actually 9 years in age. Can you explain why you gave that answer?
Yes. This is about the novel in the book Logan's Run, yep. And in those stories, the culture practices euthanasia at a certain age.
Yep.
If you read the book, you get the entire backstory as to how that all evolved. In the movie, you don't. There's just not time, and it's kind of grody. But they aged up the character in the movie so that he was more close in his late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
But in the book, you get until you're 21?
21. Yeah, 21. It's 21. Yeah. And in the film?
I want to say 35.
No, it's just 30.
Just 30.
Yeah, yeah. You're absolutely right. You've got it. Logan 3 is what the lead character is called in the book. But in the film, he's called Logan 5. And yes, you're right. In the book, people can live to the age of 21. And in the film, they can live to the age of 30. Although, I have to admit, every time I see the film, I think to myself, every one of those actors looks older than 30. Especially Michael York.
Yes.
Here's number 4. In the book, the character is nameless. In the 1960 film, he is called George. And he is played by Rod Taylor.
Is that the Illustrated Man?
Nope.
No. Rod Taylor.
In the 2002 film, he is called Alexander Hartdagen. And he is played by Guy Pearce.
The Time Machine?
Correct. Yes. In the H.G. Wells novel, we never know the name of the time traveller. He's just called the Time Traveller, I think. Obviously, in a film, when you write a script, you have to have a name for the character because you need to tell the actor who's saying the lines, So in the 1960 film, he's called George. I don't know why he's called Alexander Hartgate-Dagan in 2002. That just seems an overcomplication to me, but there you go. You're doing quite well on these. Number 5 now. In the film, a character called Jake Tanner works with another character called Major Sam Denton. And I'll give you another clue. They encounter giant scorpions.
Yes. It's Jan Michael Vincent and George Papard.
Yeah.
Not Nightmare Alley.
Nope. You got half of it.
It's not Thunder Alley. It's...
Begins with a D.
I'm drawing a blank.
Begins with a mild cuss word.
Damnation Alley?
That's it. Damnation Alley, yeah. 1977 film. Based on a novel by Roger Zelazny, I think.
Yes.
And the final question. In the book, he is Robert Neville, and he lives in Los Angeles.
I Am Legend.
Yes. Let me see if you can unpick the rest of my clues, though. In film, he was Robert Morgan and appears to live in Rome.
And that would be the Italian adaptation with Vincent Price?
That's it, yeah. In a later film, he was Robert Neville of LA.
Omega Man.
Yes. And he was played by...
the same actor from Planet of the Apes.
Yes. Chuck Heston, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the last bit of the clue was going to be, and in yet another film, he was Robert Neville of New York City.
Will Smith's I Am Legend.
That's it, yeah. And did you see there is to be a sequel?
Oh my goodness. I mean, maybe if you want to go back and try and pick up some more parts of the novel that weren't adapted, like the
good bits.
The good bits. Even in Will Smith's I Am Legend, there was a little bit of that in there because he kidnapped somebody's wife. But no, all the other cultural parts from the other side, from the vampire side, were all lost in every adaptation.
Yeah. I do have a lot of time for the version with Will Smith in it, but mostly about the first 2/3 of the film. I think are okay. Not brilliant, but there are some really good scenes in there. But it's the ending. It blows the ending. And the thing about the novel is the ending. I wouldn't call it a twist ending as such, but it's a paradigm shift of an ending. When you get to the ending of the book, you sort of interpret what's been happening in a different way. And the film just doesn't do that. The film just says, "Oh, all right, we found a cure." That's not what the story's about. Anyway.
No. Even though he telegraphs it with the title.
Well, yeah.
I Am Legend.
Yes.
It's just a question of what the legend is.
That's right, yeah. I don't know about you, I've just got one other tiny little piece of information, which is past science fiction, or actually parallel worlds science fiction. It seems that the famous filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock, once upon a time, was considering making a science fiction film. And there was an article about it on the BFI, the British Film Institute website, this week. And I think he was mostly inspired by Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Hitchcock, he didn't learn his craft in Germany because he was in the British film industry first, but he did spend some time in Germany, and he learned a lot of what he knew about film from observing the great German expressionist filmmakers. So it's interesting to hear that he was influenced by Fritz Lang and was considering making a science fiction film, but he didn't in the end. But I found that a fascinating piece of news.
Does he have a script? Does it exist? Did it survive till today?
I don't think so. I think it was just at the idea stage, and I think he jotted down some notes and he spoke about it to people, but I don't think that he took it any further than that. But I gather, I may be wrong here, but I think the information comes from a book that's just been published. So I shall have to read the book to find out.
I recently read a book called The Debarkle by Chemistros Philapton.
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah, I get to read it off a page, which is why it was easy to say. But it is a complete history of the sad and rabid puppies story from their slate voting all the way up until today. And it's very interesting how he ties it into the polarization of different communities by charismatic people looking to gain power by having people follow him. Unfortunately, what most of these communities tend to do is extremely negative. The polarization ends up with misogyny and racism and many other problems. But I had never thought of it in the context of the 2016 election in the United States or the 2020 election. I kind of understood how it tied into Comicsgate back and Gamergate back in the day.
I cannot help thinking that when historians look back to the sort of the Trump era, they're going to see that the seeds of it were sown a lot earlier than we think. I think it was all brewing, and there are hints of it in all aspects of culture, I think. Any other bits of news or past, present, or future science fiction?
Asimov's published their survey to ask readers what they thought the best of 2021 was, and I've read many of the pieces, and they're wonderful.
Yeah.
You can also pick the best cover art, which is a matter of opinion. The nomination time for the Hugos is closing, I think, sometime next week.
Right. Yeah. And that reminds me, I saw the shortlist for the British Science Fiction Association Awards as well this last week or so.
I don't suppose any semi-popular British podcasts are on the list.
I think there is, but it's not us.
Oh, well. It's still fun to do.
It is. Shall we wrap it up there, do you think?
Let's wrap it up there.
Let's wrap it up there, okay. So thank you, dear listener, for listening once again, and we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Cuskey. Our theme tune comes from purpleplanet.com. We have show notes on our website, which is at 101sf.blogspot.com, and we also have a Facebook page where you can find us as Science Fiction 101. And finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app, and why not give us a 5-star review? We quite like those when we get them. You can find us on all sorts of platforms. We're on Listen Notes, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.